Welcome to the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. My name is keiran.pedley. On this week's episode, we're going to be talking about all things Scotland. As we'll know by now, First Minister Humza Yousaf has resigned after the political fallout from the collapse in a power sharing agreement with the Greens. But what happens next, and what does it all mean for the long-term prospects for the SNP, Labour, the Conservatives, other parties, and of course the future of the constitutional question of Scottish independence too. To discuss all of this, I'm joined by people with far more knowledge than myself, including Ipsos colleagues Emily Gray and Rachel.ormston. And we're also delighted to be joined by Kezia Dugdale too. Kezia is Professor at the University of Glasgow's Centre for Public Policy and has also, as listeners will know, served as an MSP and leader of Scottish Labour. So welcome to you all.
Hello.
Thank
you.
We'll start with you, Kezia. I guess before we get into all the polling side and what happens next, what's your kind of initial reactions to what we've seen in the last few days and maybe the last week?
A bit of shock, a bit of horror, and a bit of uncertainty about what this means, both for the future of this current government in the Scottish Parliament, what it might mean for the general election and indeed the Scottish Parliament election that is likely to come in 2026, although I've already been writing this week about perhaps there's a really strong case for bringing that election forward a year. So, a real surprise. I don't think anybody really thought that the Butte House Agreement would break down under the circumstances that it did. In fact, quite a few people thought if it could survive the government abandoning its climate change credentials around the 2030 target, it could survive most things. So quite a bit of shock and a bit of uncertainty, I think, Keiran.
So, Emily, we're used to shocks, or it feels like we're used to shocks in politics. Since I was thinking back when I joined in 2019, we've had a hell of a lot of toing and froing in Westminster and Scotland and beyond. But what do you think? I mean, shocking too?
And it was, and as you say, we're used to shocks in UK politics, but maybe even more so in Scottish politics over the last couple of years. It's been a really roller coaster few days, and I don't think anyone would have anticipated a couple of weeks ago that we would be where we are now with the First Minister having announced his intention to resign. I think that's really important to note on where we are now as well. So the process from here is that Humza Yousaf has announced he intends to resign, but he hasn't yet formally resigned. So first, of course, the SNP will need to find a new leader, and there no one is, at the time of recording at least, no one's yet announced that they will stand, although we know that John Swinney and Kate Forbes have both said they're actively considering standing.
Wonderful political word, actively considering. Anyway, so yes, it's important to note we're recording this on Wednesday. Things move quickly, so let's see where we go. But Rachel, we've done some snap polling of Scottish public opinion, which obviously there'll be keen eyes on given how fast things are moving and how turbulent Scottish public opinion seems. I mean, frankly, at the best of times in the last sort of 5 years or so, but certainly everyone's keeping a keen eye on that in the run-up to the upcoming general election. So what did we do and what kind of stood out to you?
Yeah, well, I suppose, the one advantage of having had a change of leader already in the last 13 months is that we did have some questions that we had used earlier in a snap poll that we ran in the immediate aftermath of Nicola Sturgeon's shock resignation last year. So, yes, we managed to get questions out on Monday afternoon shortly after Humza Yousaf announced his intention to stand down. The first thing we were obviously interested in was asking the Scottish public what they thought about the potential runners and riders to replace him. At that time, we had a slightly longer list than perhaps people are talking about now. It does seem to have narrowed to people focusing on John Swinney and Kate Forbes. But at that point, we asked about a variety of SNP politicians, and we also actually asked people how good or bad a job they thought Douglas Ross and Anna Sarwar would do as if they were First Minister. And I guess the first thing that really stood out from that poll is that other than John Swinney and Kate Forbes, actually none of the other SNP politicians that we asked about were particularly well known among the Scottish public. They didn't seem to have really the same cut through as those two who are being talked about now as the front runners. The second thing that stood out is in terms of the public as a whole, ratings, when you ask them how good or bad a job they think each person would do as First Minister, actually John Swinney and Kate Forbes get pretty similar responses, so around 37% saying that they would do a good job, around a quarter saying that each of them would do a bad job. But then if you look at the views of people who voted SNP in 2021, they are much more clearly in favour of John Swinney in terms of their higher ratings of him compared with Kate Forbes. We then asked the public if you had to choose from the various SNP politicians that were asking about which one do you think would make the best First Minister. And actually here we see a bit of a different story. So here 26% of the public said they thought Kate Forbes would make the best First Minister versus 20% for John Swinney. Actually 20% said none of the above, some said don't know. But any of the other candidates we asked about only got 7% or less. So really again coming down to John Swinney or Kate Forbes. But again, if you look at the views of SNP voters, they are much more clearly preferring John Swinney to Kate Forbes, which I think leaves the SNP with an interesting dilemma, because they've got various challenges that they will be looking to their new leader to address. The first of which is to unify their party, which has obviously had a lot of challenges and issues around dissent and disunity over the last year or so, and in those terms, assuming obviously SNP voters aren't the same as party members or MSPs necessarily, but assuming there's some overlap, then John Swinney looks best placed to do that. But they also need to appeal to the wider public, and on that front, it's perhaps less clear that John Swinney is the front runner on that from that perspective.
And I don't know who wants to take this question, but I'm going to perform the role of ignorant Londoner, which I do so well. So, I mean, what do we need to know about John Swinney and Kate Forbes as candidates? I don't know, maybe Kezia, I'll ask you that one. I mean, what do they represent? Different wings of the SNP? What are their views on independence, other than being pro, obviously? What do we need to know about them as candidates?
Do you know, we really love ignorant Londoners in Scotland, and we particularly particularly like them when they then arrive in Scotland in the middle of a political drama and offer commentary on it. That goes down extremely well. So I'm very grateful to you for
I'll cancel the train then, Kezia. I'll cancel the train, yeah.
For leading an evidence-based reflection on what's happening. It's so interesting to hear that polling. Look, I'll try and be objective as I possibly can, because I do have skin in this game, right? I've seen both of these politicians up close. I've served with both of them in the Scottish Parliament. I think it's fair to say that John Swinney is part of a sort of dynastical group of SNP politicians who've had one role or another within the party for not 10 or 20 years, but 40 years. He's one of the 99ers. I think there are just 10 of them left who've served in the Scottish Parliament for the 25 years that it's been in place. Held a number of roles in that, including as Education Secretary, Finance Secretary, Deputy First Minister. He is, I would argue, very broadly liked across the political spectrum and in his own party. He's a thoroughly decent man, Church of Scotland guy, born in Edinburgh, worked in public service as a politician for many years. I think he had a career in pensions before that. Served as a brief time as a Member of Parliament for Perthshire, whatever the constituency name would have been in 1997, before moving to the Scottish Parliament and giving up his MP seat to concentrate on that. So, a number of years of service. He's in his early 60s. He's viewed as somebody who is best placed out of the two candidates we're talking about today to build a coalition of votes across the parliamentary floor. That's critical to understand, Keiran, because the question at the centre of this leadership contest is not the same as the one that was asked last year of the SNP membership. That was, do you want a continuity candidate or do you want to chart a different course? This year, the question is, who can keep this government together? And keeping that government together means being able to build coalitions of votes on the floor of the chamber to pass legislation and, crucially, to pass a budget. So it's fair to say that John Swinney is viewed as the best placed candidate to do that. Kate Forbes is part of a new generation of women in the SNP, still in her early 30s, joining in 2016, representing a rural constituency in Scotland. Very much liked, again, viewed slightly more on the social conservative scale, both socially and fiscally within the party, gains a lot of support through that sort of traditional view, the Fergus Ewing view of nationalism and how to build support for nationalism. And of course, has been defined in a way, whether she wanted to or not, by her staunch Christian faith. Now, John Swinney is also a very proud Christian, but it is recognised that Kate comes from a wing of the church which is much more fundamental about issues like gay marriage and abortion. Although it's worth noting that she did vote with many of her SNP colleagues yesterday in the stage 1 of that debate in favour of a current debate we're having just now around buffer zones around abortion services. So that's a very kind of long-winded history, but hopefully potted all the right things that your audience would need to know about these two candidates in as objective manner as I could probably muster.
No, absolutely. And Emily, I suppose, listening to what Kezia is saying there, one of the primary objectives of the SNP is going to be to try and avoid a Scottish Parliament election, given that our polling, most polling suggests that wherever you think the SNP might end up in such a situation, it would be much worse than it was in 2021.
Yeah, I mean, I think a snap Scottish Parliament election is now looking pretty unlikely. But I think another, so it's about, in terms of the next leader, it's about uniting the party. As Kezia says, it's also about being able to govern, so being able to get laws and budgets passed by cooperating with opposition parties. But then, of course, we've also got a general election coming up at some point before January 2025. So it also, ideally, would be somebody who is able to win voters over to the SNP. And certainly on the evidence of the poll over the last couple of days, it does look like Kate Forbes has wider appeal among the electorate than John Swinney does. It's particularly popular among those who voted for opposition parties at the last Scottish Parliament elections, also among rural voters as in Scotland, as you would expect, but less so among young people. So it's interesting to look at who's supportive and who's opposed.
I want to come in closing later to what this all means for the independence question. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about Labour. So you mentioned, Emily, that obviously general election coming. And one of the key things that people are looking out for is to what extent Labour can recover from where it's been in Scotland and gain seats there, and what that might mean for a potential majority Keir Starmer might have in Westminster. But Rachel, what do we see as the direction for Labour here? Obviously an opportunity, but they've got their own challenges, haven't they, to try and balance those yes and no votes, and for Anna Sarwar to try and sort of convey the right messages as a Scottish leader as well.
Yeah, they do. And I know we've talked about this, Keiran. I think at the moment they have a kind of particular set of circumstances where the SNP are having a lot of their own challenges. Their strategy on independence isn't particularly clear. We know in terms of the issues that the Scottish public is currently concerned about, independence is fairly low down that list. So it's when you ask people what they think the most important issues facing Scotland are, it's very much those bread and butter issues of cost of living, NHS, education, the economy, etc. Even actually among SNP voters, more people mention the NHS than mention independence at the moment. So at the moment they have a kind of opportunity, I guess, to focus on those issues and focus away on the from issues of independence. But that is not to say that question has in any way gone away. And actually, as we've discussed, the polling on support for independence has been pretty flat over the last year or so. So while SNP support has been going down, support for independence hasn't been affected in the same way. And therefore, for Scottish Labour, because they do need, in order to increase their vote further, to appeal to people who left them for the SNP effectively, they do need to straddle that ability to appeal to pro-independence voters as well as to their unionist voters, which is a much more difficult challenge for them, because the Tories are very clearly we're just unionists. They're not very likely, they don't attract that many yes voters, and don't really expect to. The SNP are obviously avowedly pro-independence. Labour is a unionist party, but has to try and appeal to both camps actually, and that remains a really challenging issue for them, and one that I'm sure their opponents will want to bring out in the general election campaign, and that they will want to avoid, frankly.
I sometimes refer to the independence question as like a dormant volcano, because as you say, it's not the priority issue right now for Scottish people. It's very clear from the polling, but at the same time, I'm not sure I'd put my house on which way a referendum would go right now if there was to be one. And so it's only so secure you could consider the union under those circumstances, I suppose. That's just my view anyway. But Kezia, as a former Labour leader in Scotland, what do you think about some of these issues that Rachel raises, and clearly a huge opportunity for Labour politically going into the general election and beyond? It's not just about Westminster, but obviously there's a few things to navigate there, and public opinion, as we've said, is quite volatile in Scotland. So a few points here and there can make the difference between Labour gaining a handful of seats and several dozen.
Yes, and Rachel's absolutely correct to point to the dichotomy of both trying to appeal to SNP voters and Conservative voters, which is difficult in most circumstances, right? And I would argue it is easier now than it was when I was Labour leader. Now, I would say that, wouldn't I? But the point I'm trying to make is that, when I was leader between 2015 and 2017, the independence question was the central question of Scottish politics, and it defined how most people voted. It's also true now to say that that's not the case. And as Rachel's just described, independence is, of course, very important to people. It's still an issue in that top 10 issues list of what people care about. Movement around how people feel towards it is pretty solid. We know that at least 45% of the population support independence. That can tip over 50, it can tip back. But crucially, the difference now in 2023, 24, and looking ahead to both 25 and 26, is it feels very much like cost of living is going to be the central election question. How people feel about family finances, how they feel about the economy more generally is going to define how they vote in Scotland in a way that in previous electoral contests it has been the Constitution. That makes it easier for Anas and his colleagues to appeal to both Conservative and SNP voters. I didn't say easy, just easier, right? So what you see in Anas Sarwar's platform is a real focus on two main substantive policy areas. One is the economy, in the hope, I guess, of producing more of a pro-business platform than Labour have perhaps argued in the past. He can aim to peel off some Conservative voters in some parts of the country, but also appealing to SNP voters on a cost of living basis. The idea that under Labour, family financial circumstances will improve, the outlook for the economy will be better, and also on the NHS, the idea that we all have somebody right now in our family or in our lives who is waiting for an appointment, whether it's to get a GP or some sort of routine procedure in hospital. There's a growing sense that the NHS is in a real existential crisis. Focusing on the economy and the NHS is a way that he can try and appeal voters back from both Conservatives and the SNP. And he doesn't have to worry about losing one in favour of the other, because he doesn't really have to talk about the Constitution. In fact, I suspect he won't talk about the Constitution at all if he can possibly help it between now and 2026.
So final remarks, because I know that we've only got a couple of minutes left. I'll go around you in turn, probably come to you, Emily, first, then Rachel, then finally to Kezia. But let's imagine, and as a pollster, I'm always loath to do this, but let's imagine that there is going to be a Labour government in Westminster with Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, Rachel Reeves as Chancellor. Certainly looks that way at the moment, with all the kind of caveats we usually put on that. What do we think their priorities will be vis-a-vis Scotland in the next sort of 5 years, let's say, in a Labour government? Is it about those bread and butter issues, or I know Gordon Brown's been talking a lot about sort of constitutional reform alongside that, and so on and so forth. So what do we think, without knowing him personally, Keir Starmer's priorities would be as Prime Minister for Scotland in the next couple of years? Emily, a couple of brief words from you.
I think 5 years is one thing, but I think there will be also the immediate, first 100 days in government. What announcements are there about Scotland and Labour? Because I think voters will want to see that. But I think more broadly, just to build on what Kezia has said, I think we're seeing something that's very powerful for Labour just now is this sense among voters that it's time for a change. You see that UK-wide, but maybe even more powerfully in Scotland. And of course, the SNP have been in power here for 17 years, and the Conservatives for a long time UK-wide as well. So I think that real sense of, Britain and Scotland are ready for a fresh team of leaders is something that we're seeing come across very, very strongly in polls and focus groups just now.
Rachel.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I suppose what I would say is I would like to see Keir Starmer. I think he should be focusing on Scotland in both the first 100 days and the first 5 years, because I suppose the danger is that he either sort of forgets about Scotland or makes missteps in terms of making announcements about policy as though they affect the whole of the UK, where we're actually on devolved issues and so on. So I think there is quite a lot of risk actually for Anas Sarwar, who will be facing an election, probably maybe 18 months after the general election, of any missteps by the UK Labour government then being a disadvantage for Scottish Labour. So I think as much as focusing on the kinds of issues that we've been talking about, so the economy, funding for the NHS, which has of course devolved, but more funding for the English NHS will transfer in terms of the Barnett formula. So those kinds of issues would likely be popular, but he will also need to just handle things carefully and make sure that he is governing the whole of the UK and remembering the differences across the country.
And final word to Kezia. So we talk about balancing the needs for the bread and butter issues versus, I guess, the constitutional question, be that independence itself or just wider arrangements.
Sure. So I've long thought there's a real opportunity for the SNP to rebuild the aftermath of Labour winning a UK general election before the 2026 Scottish Parliament elections, because I think they could default very quickly to a Stronger for Scotland message. So and rally around some issues that Labour are uncomfortable on. So most notably, if the SNP get their act together, they could really hone in on attitudes towards immigration, attitudes towards Brexit and Europe more broadly, and also on welfare, and really cause Labour a little bit of pain in those early days. Now, the way for Labour to counter that, which is my way of pivoting to your actual question rather than what I wanted to say, Kieran, in that classic politician fashion, is the two-child cap. So that is one way Labour could indicate pretty strongly and pretty quickly how it's different from the Conservatives, and also kind of quash an attack line that the SNP would build.
Essentially.
Getting rid of the two-child cap, which we know from the Resolution Foundation is the single biggest one move you could take to tackle child poverty. So we really need Keir Starmer to do something like that on the welfare agenda, I think, in Scotland, to show that critical difference, which would help from ahead of the 2026 election.
Great. Well, fascinating discussion. Thank you all so much for joining me. That was the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. Big thanks to my guests, Emily Gray, Rachel.ormston, and of course, Kezia Dugdale. Lots more to come, I'm sure, in the coming days and weeks on this, but do check out our polling this week of the Scottish public. That's online now on the Ipsos website. Lots of detail there on what the Scottish public think of the different leaders and the future of Scotland and the independence question too. But for now, thanks for watching/listening and have a great day.